If you've watched this channel for any length of time, you probably know that I was raised in a deeply fundamentalist branch of Christianity. But alongside the religion itself came something else, and that was conspiracy theories. As a kid, my home church aired 9/11 conspiracy theories, like within the church during church services. And to this day, my dad is a flat earther because of the Bible. And I have other family members that believe that there's like a satanic cabal that is manipulating the entire world, including media and medicine and politicians, economies and governments. Evolution is fake. The moon landing is fake. Vaccines cause autism. Scientists are lying. Medical professionals are lying. Historians are lying. Everyone's lying, and reality itself is suspect. So if you grew up in spaces like this, you already know that this mindset is not rare whatsoever. So my question is, why is there so much overlap between fundamentalism or fundamentalist Christianity and conspiracy culture? This is the Silent Republic. My high school science curriculum was made by Answers in Genesis, which is a fundamentalist Christian organization that promotes literal 6-day creation of the earth and interpreting Genesis quite literally. And yes, I was homeschooled. I was taught that evolution was a lie, but more than a lie, it was evil, a deception propagated by Satan himself to lead people away from the faith, away from God, and to make them atheists. My mother didn't vaccinate us because she believed that vaccines cause autism and that vaccines were made with aborted babies. I was taught that there were satanic elites that are operating from the shadows, controlling all of society, a shadow government manipulating culture and media and science and politics. And yes, Alex Jones and InfoWars was frequent viewing in my house as a kid. But here's the important part, because this wasn't just my family. This mindset existed across the entire church I grew up in, across entire networks of people. And once you understand the worldview, like underneath it, the overlap between fundamentalism and conspiracy theories, it actually starts to make like a sort of disturbing sense. Christian fundamentalism, it rests on like a central doctrine, and that's biblical inerrancy, which is the belief that the Bible is literally perfect. And not only is it perfect, it is like completely without error, and it is divinely inspired by God. So to question the Bible is not merely to question a book, it is to question God himself, and that creates a problem. Because if the Bible's wrong about something like creation, and then you pull that thread, the question is, what else is the Bible wrong about? Because eventually fundamentalism collides with reality, and it has to interact with the disciplines of like cosmology and biology, archaeology, the different scientific disciplines, and what science says and what a fundamentalist interpretation of the Bible says tell two very different stories. And I want to make it clear that this is not all of Christianity. There are Christian traditions that hold different interpretive lenses for the Bible, and they approach it differently, right? This is like a certain brand of evangelical Christianity, this fundamentalist view. And though that is true today, there is a history of religious institutions pushing back on scientific progress. You know, the Catholic Church notoriously threatened Galileo for his theory of heliocentrism back during the late medieval period during the Enlightenment. But what I think makes the modern conspiracy culture so different than anything in times past is the advent of the internet. So from the 90s and the early 2000s, what you had was suddenly an avenue where nearly anyone could find thousands of like-minded people. And that was in the forms of chat rooms and forums and even early YouTube. And suddenly you had entire ecosystems being built that offered different explanations for reality. And so it's during this time that we see like the flat earth conspiracy resurge, because there was a movement a long time ago, but the internet allowed it to kind of come back. You also saw like the vaccine conspiracy crowd really coalesced during this time, and just endless conspiracies. And so fundamentalists that were looking to preserve their interpretations, they found those spaces online. And the framework had already been laid with people like Kent Hovind, who preached this sort of fundamentalist interpretation of the Bible. And so like the framework and the way of thinking was already there. But what the internet did is it just dialed everything up to 11, and it just allowed a lot of different people to suddenly interconnect and to find one another. So it was at this point that these ideas could organize and reinforce each other and just spread endlessly. And if I'm honest, like if I stop and place myself back in those shoes at that time, this makes like a frightening amount of sense. Because if you truly believe that the Bible is the literal foundation of truth, then anything that disagrees with the Bible, it doesn't feel academic. It quickly feels existential to you. So when scientists or historians or institutions say something that contradicts your worldview, and then you go online and you find hundreds of thousands of millions of people that agree and reaffirm you and say, yeah, you're right, they're lying to us, that becomes very emotionally powerful. And the terrifying thing about conspiracy thinking is that it becomes self-sealing. Like the lack of evidence becomes evidence, and contradictions become like proof of suppression, and failed predictions simply evolve into larger conspiracy theories. Because within their framework, the rabbit hole always goes deeper, and the corruption always goes down another layer. Because the conclusion was never arrived at through evidence. The conclusion was already there, and then the system was built around it to reinforce that conclusion. This is like the polar opposite, the literal antithesis of the scientific method. And so for many of these fundamentalist Bible-believing Christians, the Bible being incorrect about something or wrong, it wouldn't just be so simple as that. And it wouldn't be so simple as them just changing their minds. It would mean shattering the very foundation of their identity and morality, family, and their understanding of the world itself. And so at its core, I think it's fear that drives a lot of this. And the overlap exists kind of because it must. We live in an age of genetics and the fossil record being known, radiometric dating, and like observable speciation. And so when these people read in the book of Genesis that God formed man from the dust and breathed his life into him, these kind of tensions just become unbearable, and they have to reject it wholesale. Because remember, within their worldview, if the Bible is wrong about something like creation, it can be wrong about anything else, morality and salvation, God himself. And so the pressure becomes enormous to resolve these tensions. And if you're operating from the assumption that the Bible must be true, then outlandish ideas begin to feel very plausible. Things like corrupted institutions and deceptive scientists and hidden evidence and hidden agendas. And it's not because any of these things are well evidenced, but it's that they help preserve this larger framework and worldview. And this extends beyond like scientific conspiracies, and it quickly gets into political ones, because many of these evangelical fundamentalist Christians are also something called dispensationalists. That basically means that they believe that like history is rapidly approaching its end. And part of this end is that they believe that there's going to be this figure called the Antichrist that will rise and establish a one world government, a global system of control, and a final tribulation before Jesus Christ returns. And within that framework, like conspiratorial thinking almost must exist, because like, of course there's shadowy governments making way for the Antichrist. Every government is suspect, and every institution is working towards this end. And that's not to say that institutions can't be corrupted and governments don't do shady things, but they take what is a kernel of truth and they spin it into this. And within this framework, the Bible, they believe, it already foretold all of this. And what's really fascinating is that every generation tends to do this to at least some extent, where they sort of apply these various prophecies to themselves. Like literally Christian history is just rife with this. Every generation does it. And so ancient texts about Babylon or Rome and Greece get like remapped onto modern nation states. Suddenly, microchips become mark of the beast, and political leaders become the antichrist, and geopolitical events become signs of the end. And at the end of the day, what I can't help but see is just like how powerful the human mind can actually be. Like how deeply we can convince ourselves of almost anything if the emotional need is great enough. Because when the need to preserve a worldview becomes absolute, there are essentially no limits that we won't go to preserve that worldview. I know I'm harsh towards fundamentalists, but that's because like I come from this world. Like I was formed by it and I was wounded by it and I left it. And I know that many of these people, they're not pretending. They like genuinely believe this with all their hearts. And I can remember the fear at the questioning itself and how existential those questions became so quickly. But I also can't ignore the consequences because like these beliefs don't remain isolated. They don't stay within homes or churches alone. They go out and they spread and they start to influence like public policy and elections and political leaders actually believe this stuff. They literally shape how millions of people interpret reality itself. And so many people that hold political power today are committed to these frameworks and these conspiratorial ways of thinking. So while I empathize with like the normal or average people that are raised in and trapped within these systems, I also see how that system is so dangerous to everyone and the world at large. And it's not because the followers of these traditions are stupid, but it's because the conspiratorial thinking actually becomes the logical outcome of their presuppositions. When your system of belief can't bend, then reality itself becomes suspect. This is the Silent Republic.